Absolute cinema. Hi everyone, my name is Michael, and welcome to what was supposed to be the first actual video for the channel. Weeks ago I had a Laggy video planned, and things have obviously developed since then. I'm glad I held off and can now work on this video knowing that Laggy is going to be coming to Monster Hunter Wilds in Title Update 2. There is a lot of debate about the pronunciation of Lagiacrus, but there is no debate about just how popular it is within the community. How did it reach third in the community poll despite it not being in a game for 7 years and a lot of new players never even encountering it before? What makes Lagiacrus so special, and why has everyone been banging on about this monster for such a long time now? Over 10 years ago, I was a young lad that had only ever seen and played one Wii game, Wii Sports. The only reason I ever started playing Monster Hunter was because of the MH3 box art. I like dinosaurs, and even though the Monster Hunter name actually kinda scared me, I saw this dude on the front and I was like, hell yeah. I ended up getting the game and giving it a red hot crack, Wii Remote and nunchuck in hand. The opening cutscene was just incredible and kinda helped validate the whole dinosaur thing even more. I continued through the initial quests and obviously was shitting my pantaloons when you're underwater and this thing comes barreling in while you're trying to gather monster guts. We saw this early game flagship ambush, starting with Tigrex and Freedom 2, continuing with 3rd gen and then into 4th gen. And it was a great setup tool. When you're a new player and you are still figuring out controls, you have nothing but leather armor and an iron sword, and you are put in this position like this, it creates such an immersive fear. The fact that in MH3 you're underwater and you are in this creature's element just dials up that fear even more. Many folks will probably tell you about their first encounter with Tigrex, Zenoga, Gormagala, or even Glavenus, with these invasions being their first memorable experience with the series, and how that set a baseline for your progression as a player. Throughout MH3 Village, Laggy serves an important role in benchmarking your growth as a hunter. At the start of the game, a rappel quest where you have the advantage fighting entirely on land, and the full hunt where everything you've learnt is put to the test, fighting on the back foot underwater and more offensively when on land. We saw this concept iterated on with World as well, where you got snippets of the Nergigante fight early as preparation for the real thing. MH3 also introduced the concept of setting up the flagship as the game's big bad through the story and then subverting that with a final boss. As far as you're concerned, Laggy is responsible for the earthquakes affecting Moga Village, and that's why your journey as a hunter even began. Monster Hunter has never had a large emphasis put on the story or plot lines within these games. The story is there to serve and progress the gameplay, which is completely fine. Flagship monsters have often been set up as these character-like figures within these stories from an ecological perspective, and then that is used as the basis to create a strong connection to the player through gameplay. It's crazy that as members in the community, we talk so much about rosters in these games as though these creatures we go out and fight and kill over and over again are actual characters. We want to see these characters again, and their personalities and gear and fights as often as we can. And I think that is a testament to how well Monster Hunter has been able to deliver moments and memories through gameplay to create powerful connections with players without it being a story-driven experience. I think Laggy is a shining example of this idea, combining all of these elements with more obvious things like a great OST on a fan-favorite map, pioneering the Leviathan skeleton, the fight, the gear, the striking visual design into one iconic character of the series. Because it has been absent from the series for so long due to development issues, it has become the forbidden fruit of the franchise for so many players, and that has just increased the desire from the community to relive their nostalgia and connections with this character even more, especially now that Monster Hunter has grown so much since Laggy's last appearance in Old Gen with GU. There's no doubt that World has had an enormous impact on the franchise, with it making massive leaps from old gen in terms of gameplay, visuals, and accessibility. It brought Monster Hunter into the modern era of gaming to a massive Western audience, the majority of which had been waiting for the series to move away from being handheld exclusive. Prior to MH3, Monster Hunter had been exclusive to the PSP for the West, with Freedom, Freedom 2, and Freedom Unite being the only localized games outside of Japan. It's interesting looking at all the sales data for all the old gen Monster Hunter games and the consoles they were on. In Japan, the PSP was insanely popular around this time, and while the Wii was conversely more popular globally, it comparatively sold less in Japan since the handheld market was much stronger there. If you look at the sales data up to 3 Ultimate, MH3 has only sold a total of 1.9 million copies. Because the handheld Japanese market drove Monster Hunter early on, most of those players were on PSP instead of the console releases for MH1 and MH2. The home console market was smaller in Japan than it was globally, and I think the proportion of MH3 sales in global markets because of the Wii's success in those regions led to a lot of growth for the series outside of Japan. It's no coincidence that MH3 made its way to little old me in Australia at the time, since every man and his dog had a Wii, and that folks like me had never even heard of the series prior. MH3 was reaching more new players than ever before, and with the Wii having slightly more powerful hardware than before, the visuals taking a step forward helped immerse these players that were dipping their toes into the series for the first time. Pardon the pun there, but the addition of underwater combat was very unique even by today's standards, and it did add to the gameplay and changed the dynamic of a few hunts, and Laggy was at the center of this new mechanic. But this came at a cost. Entire weapon types were missing, and the amount of content was very light. The small roster was strong and impactful though, with the debut of some great monster designs. The Wii Remote and Nunchuck were also pretty weird and made it harder to play well within an already janky and punishing game. But these bizarre controls didn't stop new players like myself from getting hooked by Monster Hunter's powerful gameplay loop, learning mechanics, and getting used to the pre-flight checklist of item management, eating, and the farm. I think MH3 had a very similar effect to World, albeit on a much smaller scale. Having gone back and played Freedom Unite, in my opinion there is definitely a noticeable difference going from 2nd to 3rd gen, mostly in terms of visuals and gameplay. And I think that same gap between 3rd and 4th gen is a lot smaller, especially if you're looking at the end of 3rd gen with 3U on the Wii U, and the end of 4th gen with GU on the Switch. All of this to say that I think pre-5th gen, MH3 might have introduced the largest amount of new global players to the franchise. The small amount of online polls I could find on this topic do seem to line up with this theory. All of these 3rd gen folks that have continued on with the series are obviously going to have big time nostalgia for Laggy, with it being the focal point of their first game. You can expand that out to old gen players in general that also played Generations or GU and were able to encounter Laggy for the last time, before it became absent from the franchise for all of 5th gen while Monster Hunter was just starting to take off. As an older player, I've been very lucky to be able to watch all these newer players, streamers, and friends experience so many of these iconic monster designs for the first time because of World. It has been an absolute joy to see other folks be challenged by and react to the industry-leading encounter design Monster Hunter has been offering for such a long time now, and to relive memories I have as a player through others. And I think a lot of gamers in general are in the same boat, where it's so much fun watching people play difficult games, watching them be tested and triumph in their own way, just as you did. Laggy is one of the last iconic monsters that a lot of newer Monster Hunter players haven't even seen yet, and I think that is a big reason for so many older players wanting it to return as well. Not just so people like me can take a trip down memory lane, but so the newer player base can finally get to encounter a monster that is held in such high regard. No doubt if we were to go through all of 6th gen without No Gigante returning, I think there would be a similar effect, where there would be a huge demand for it to return by that point, since a large group of players that started with World will be asking why it hasn't been in a game for what would be 5+ years. I don't imagine this will be the case with No Gigante though, just because Laggy specifically has been in well-documented development hell for a long time now. We've all seen the World prototype video, and we know that ground collision has been the main issue with the implementation of Laggy since World. There have been many articles and interviews talking about this issue, where the terrains and environments being much more varied and uneven from 5th gen onward are making it difficult for longer snake-like bodies that are in contact with the ground to be implemented. Laggy has a lot of contact points to the ground, more so than other Leviathans that prop themselves up more like Mizitsune or Elmadron, and the amount of processing needed within the engine to accurately calculate how all these contact points on the body interact with the minute changes in terrain have been the main issue. Different development teams have each made different attempts across World, Iceborne, Rise and Sunbreak to implement laggy and solve this issue to no avail, which is why it is such a huge deal that the team at Capcom have finally been able to get over this hump and find a solution to an issue that they've been having since World's development. Either they have found a solution to the collision issue, or they may have made a decision to prop laggy up off the ground slightly to make it less challenging to implement. It looks to be the former, since we can see that most of Uthduna's body is seemingly in contact with the ground. Watery surfaces may also be able to help hide any issues or help make laggy appear like it's in contact with more of the ground than it actually is. If the issue has been solved, this also means that it could be possible for other monsters suffering from the same issue in the past, like Agnaktor, Najarala, or even Zamtrios, to finally be on the table as viable monsters that could also return. I remember a lot of folks were talking about the presence of Uroktor and Zamites in Rise without Agnaktor and Zamtrios, and I think that this collision issue is the reason why we didn't see them make an appearance in Rise or Sunbreak. Expanding on roster selection since World, I would like to just illustrate the absolute insanity of just how many appearances the other old gen flagships, or some variation of them, have had since World. Rathalos, 3 times with multiple variants. Kushala, twice plus a variant. Tigrex, twice plus a variant. Nagakuga, twice plus a variant. Zenoga, twice plus a variant and an apex. Brachydios, once with a variant. Gore, twice plus a variant. Seregios, once. Mizitsune, twice plus a variant and an apex. Astalos, once. Glavenus, once plus a variant. And lastly, Valstrax with 2 variants. What more can I say? The only other flagship that has been in this purgatory with laggy is Gammoth, and with its size and skeleton most likely making it even harder to implement, you have to ask yourself, it was built in a game almost 10 years ago on a handheld console that was only capable of outputting in 240p. How bad could it be? A lot of people were happy to see Mizitsune announced as the first addition to WoW's roster with Title Update 1, but there was also disappointment regarding the selection, as Gammoth is the last member of the Fated Four yet to make its appearance since Old Gen, along with Laggy, who has since been announced. Both Ark and Nova Bushido made great videos talking about this more, and I think they are both spot on to question Mizitsune being the first addition for a title update, especially since it had 3 variations in the previous game alone. With Laggy finally coming to Wilds, we may also be able to see some new additions to the Leviathan and Snake Wyvern classes among others that were previously off the table because of ground collision issues. There has been a lot of speculation regarding development issues and content being pushed back into title updates that was perhaps slated for the release version of the game. The fact that there was no gathering hub on release and that Zoshia was not properly implemented with craftable gear and a repeatable fight in high rank are just 2 examples of things that I think were planned for launch and didn't make it for release because of time constraints. We've all seen the laggy nest out of bounds in the Scarlet Forest, and there are plenty of threads online that you can find and read detailing game assets that were found in the game as far back as the open beta tests. I think laggy was originally planned for base Wilds and was very close to making the final cut. It would explain a lot, and it makes sense with the development timeline since I think there was such a huge response from the community regarding the game's horrendous performance issues that the final quarter of development was more focused on improving performance, fixing bugs, and getting core features ready, rather than finishing off the rest of the planned roster. One theory in the community is that Jin Dahad needed a lot more work than anticipated, and fixing a lot of bugs and getting it ready for release was one of the main issues in the last part of development that may have put laggy on the back burner to later be finished and put into the game with a title update. And that does line up. I have personally experienced bugs with Jin Dahad where I've seen it floating in midair, getting stuck on terrain and walls. No doubt a lot of people were dialing into all of the Wilds news prior to launch and were pretty disappointed when laggy wasn't in the game on launch or part of a day 1 patch, once again delaying its return and adding fuel to the fire that had been burning for years. I think this was actually for the best, to be honest. I think Wilds as a whole could have been delayed and really could have benefited from more time in development before releasing. Aside from performance issues, I talked about a lot of different areas in my previous video that I thought were lacking, and I am fundamentally in support of things taking longer if it results in a better end product. Most of the game was good to go. It has sold extremely well, and I have really enjoyed my release experience with the game. I just think that more time would have elevated the game even higher, and a lot of smaller gripes from myself and others would have been resolved or in a much better state. With Title Update 2 being revealed, I'm glad that Laggy has been delayed and given more development time so that it can truly shine in Wilds as a headliner for the next title update. Alongside the technical issues with Laggy's development in recent years, there has also been a lot of debate within the community regarding the return of underwater combat and monsters like Laggy as a result. Since a lot of players have come on board in recent years, I think the novelty and idea has gained more traction since a lot of these players have heard about the mechanic or seen it in 3rd gen and are intrigued about it being brought back post 5th gen. Even though the controls and movement have been heavily criticized, and a small portion of the roster and maps actually utilized underwater areas in 3rd gen, I think a lot of players have fallen in love with the idea of a more refined iteration of aquatic gameplay on top of traditional terrestrial combat. I am personally in the camp who would prefer underwater combat to not return. Instead, I would prefer the devs to focus on more important things than investing a huge amount of resources into a comparatively small aspect of the game. In my previous video, I talked about how Wilds kind of seemed unfinished in certain areas on launch, and that there were still a lot of issues that hadn't improved since World. No doubt some form of compromise would have to be made in order for something like underwater combat to return. Unfortunately, I think MH3 on the whole suffered as a result of this. Even though I started with this game and I love it to bits, I'm not going to sit here and say that the subtraction of dual blades, gun lance, hunting horn, and bow is an acceptable compromise for the addition of the switch axe and a mechanic that only affected a small portion of the game and that hunters generally didn't prefer to grounded combat and traversal. Outside of Gen Moran, Devil Joe, and Elatrion, there was no endgame to speak of, and charm tables were straight up embarrassing. MH3 was the only time weapon types have been absent from a game. I can only imagine what the community response would be to a new game today if completely rebuilding underwater combat came at the cost of entire weapon types, other core features, performance issues, and bugs. I think the demand for underwater combat to return is mostly coming from 3rd gen hunters that can't see the forest for the trees, or newer players from 5th gen that have never played with the feature and want to experience it in modern Monster Hunter. There are many folks that didn't like Laggy's landlocked fight in 4th gen and have been saying that Laggy needs underwater combat to return because that is what made the monster and its fight unique. It's a really strange discussion point because a lot of people who think this believe that Laggy on land was too easy in 3rd gen and then didn't like fighting it in 4th gen when they expanded it and added more moves to make it more difficult. Since it was given more attacks and the ability to charge on land like Ivory from 3U, from what I can gather from the community, hunters didn't like specific moves like the spinning electric orbs or the big AoE blasts because they made the fight boring. My response to that would be, find a more enjoyable way to engage with those mechanics then. You can see I'm using an unoptimized low-rank adept hammer setup in this gameplay, and I was having a ton of fun trying to use the knowledge I have of the fight, trying to use something off meta. The actual reason I think some folks don't like 4th gen Laggy or Ivory was simply because the old gen combat was janky, and that it used to be way more punishing to be out of position even by a small amount. Big sweeping hitboxes and AoE attacks in old gen were just harder to deal with because we didn't have the modern movement like we do post-World. Sheathing was on a different button to sprint, and it was more of an animation commitment. We stayed still for an eternity to heal. We didn't have moveset options like guard dash on lance or tackle on greatsword. We couldn't even roll backwards. In Generations, we had a few more tools with styles and arts that did help, but we were still on the old movement system, and I think that the scarcity of quality of life made old gen way harder in general. I think Ivory and 4th gen Laggy might be copping flack for just exacerbating a deeper flaw with old school Monster Hunter combat, something that we were all completely fine with when we were playing at the time, but something we can look back on now with hindsight from modern Monster Hunter and say, damn, That shit was archaic. That kind of artificial difficulty associated with certain gameplay mechanics in monster attacks or hitboxes. For me, that is what the entirety of old gen Monster Hunter was. A janky, punishing form of gameplay that was clunky, but rewarded positioning and movement within those confines, and I enjoyed that. I think 4th gen Laggy was completely fine in that context, and a fun fight, where at least we didn't have to worry about the even more restrictive movement and movesets of our weapons underwater. Instead of Laggy having an advantage underwater and that making the fight better or more interesting as people claim, because of a janky underwater mechanic that made it more difficult in an artificial way, the fight was just made harder on land, and you have plenty of tools alongside styles and hunter arts to compensate for the new moves Laggy had in Generations. All the different iterations all serve different roles in their respective games, and I think saying that Laggy needs underwater combat to be an interesting or engaging fight like it was in 3rd gen is a complete cop-out. That may be a bit of a hot take, especially coming from someone that started with MH3, but I think we are going to see that point proven with Laggy's return in Wilds in a few months. With so many years in development hell, I'm sure the boardroom at Capcom has been full of ideas and changes to Laggy that are going to make its implementation in Wilds the best yet. Since fighting underwater was more restrictive and difficult in 3rd gen, that caused a natural preference for most players to just prefer fighting on land and not enjoying the aquatic portion of fights like Laggy nearly as much, even though it may have been the best of a bad bunch. In Wilds, we are not going to have that issue, and hopefully the devs are going to be able to take everything they have learned from the 3 iterations that have been on land in the past to elevate the fight to a new level. Starting from 5th gen, a lot of changes have been made to modernize returning monsters, and I think the majority of the additions have been positive. Animation and movement have both improved dramatically since old gen, both for monsters and for the player. In old gen, movement was very rudimentary, and it made positioning even more important than it is in modern Monster Hunter. Most monsters often stayed in place while turning at angles to face you, and hunters were often locked into animations and were a lot more limited with directional movement after certain actions. Slower, heavier hitting weapons like Greatsword and Hammer were very powerful in old gen because you could position and time your big charges to land just as a monster finished turning in this way. A lot of fights in old gen were very easy if you knew how to take advantage of this, and Laggy definitely suffered from this lack of mobility. Its elongated head and large tail were very easy and satisfying to just beat on in old gen, and I think that will change with Wilds. We are going to have to work a lot harder to get those breaks, since we can no longer abuse rigid, old school monster movement. I think Laggy is going to be a lot more mobile, and the difficulty is going to feel a lot more natural as a result, instead of the difficulty partly coming from jankiness like it did in old gen. I have a feeling that the AoE attacks are definitely going to be there, but they're going to feel a lot more avoidable because of modern mobility, and I would bet that the Scarlet Forest being covered in water is going to play some role with electrified water, similar to what we saw with Namiel in Iceborne. I'm really looking forward to the new gameplay gimmicks as well as the new visual redesign. The new roar we heard from the title update teaser sounds fantastic, and I can't wait to hear the new rendition of the old OST. I'm also looking forward to the gear having more of an identity, with the armor sets in the past kind of being all over the place in terms of skills. In MH3 we had faster swimming, element attack up, and razor sharp. In 3U that changed to weakness exploit, focus, and free element. And then in Generations we had stamina recovery and guard added to the pool of skills as well. I'm thinking that some sort of new mechanic or skill will be introduced to focus the use case of the armor more, perhaps relating to element in some way. I would like to see the weapons gain something more unique as well, since in past games they were often just high raw, low element weapons with average sharpness. Ashen weapons are indeed a thing, and Raydao is already in the game as one of the featured monsters, so it will be interesting to see how the Laggy gear will compare, and if there will be some form of title update power creep. I'm so glad that the campaign for Laggy to return to Monster Hunter can finally end. I hope I've done an adequate job of adding some context to why everyone has been talking so much about why this iconic monster's debut in the modern era of the franchise is so special. We have so much to look forward to with Wilds, and despite my previous video being quite critical of the game on release, that came from a place of enthusiasm to keep seeing this franchise expand and improve. I'm looking forward to jumping back in for Title Update 1 on the 4th, and for Laggy's long-awaited return in Title Update 2. We are just going to have to wait a little bit longer. Thanks for watching, and happy hunting, guys.